Late in July of this year, 2012, my wife and I received this invitation to the launch of a book that I've been associated with for the last 10 years as a researcher, doing work for Professor Peter Fitzpatrick, until recently in charge of the drama department at Monash University. And the reason I was chosen as a researcher was that back in the 70s, I'd done a lot of work on this man, Francis W. Thring. Born 1882, died 1936. He was the businessman who started the Hoyt's cinema chain around Australia, one of Australia's largest cinema chains, and built the various Regent theatres around Australia. And then in 1931, with this rather attractive logo, launched the first professional sound film studio in Australia. I was always intrigued by this film studio, FT, modestly named after his own initials, and consequently had interviewed a lot of the people who were involved with that studio at the start of my broadcasting career back about 1978. All of those people are now passed away, of course, because the events that we're talking about were back in the early 1930s. But Peter Fitzpatrick, who was one of the nicest people I've ever had the opportunity of working with, picked me up as a researcher for his project, which was the biography of the two Frank Thrings, Frank Thring the father, Frank Thring the actor's son. So on the 2nd of August, I went along to the launch of the book at Peter's invitation and managed to catch just a few little bits of the opening speeches by the distinguished Australian actor Graeme Blundell. And here's the little that we managed to catch.
And devoted an inordinate amount of energy to concealing his tracks. And as Peter writes, Frank the son masked a thoroughly reclusive personality with such flamboyant self-parody. It's a big story that Peter so fastidiously tracked down. These two carefully crafted public selves made their very distinctive marks across a century of the performing arts in Australia, and their combined, sometimes juxtaposed narratives are part of a larger one. They share centre stage with each other, but also concede space to those around them, setting the directions our film and theatre industries would take. It's a fine achievement, even if the fine prose and the lovely sense of detail makes the task look easy. A biographer is always, and we were talking about this in the green room, Peter and I, a biographer is always asked, how can you be sure that you're getting it right? Well, you can't be sure. All you can do is look at what a person has left behind, even if they're still alive. You look at the feelings they've left in others. You look at the little things, anything you can find out about. You ask people how they kept their car, his taste in booze, was he punctual? A fastidious man who sent thank you notes. You find out, whether he returned things on time. Did he remember birthdays? You do enough of this, and this kind of investigation, you start to get a picture of a character who does things for reasons that make sense to other people. Bert Newton, and I discovered Frank was all over YouTube. A story that comes out at the end of Peter's book wonderfully illustrates his enduring appeal. Frank wanted no funerals. He wanted that great actor Freddie Parslow to hire a tiger moth. Imagine that, any of you who've Freddie Parslow. To hire a tiger moth and scatter his ashes over Port Phillip Bay. But Fred and his wife Joan had visions of little bits of Frank falling on unsuspecting fishermen below. They took the urn and a sheaf of tuberose to Queenscliff. We walked out to the end of the very long pier, trying to calculate the direction of the wind, Joan Parslow told Peter. It was very blustery and the waves were choppy. Each of us took a turn to cast Frank on the waters, trying not to get him all over us. Then we realised that the tide was surging in, and watched as the ashes and the roses rode the waves until they all washed up on the shore. Frank would have loved it. So, Peter, consider the two Frank Thrings well and truly launched.
Hopefully, Peter, your tyres will now be quite rightly fairly pumped up, but I'm going to pump them up a little bit more before handing over to you to respond to Graeme. Peter is Honorary Professor of Performing Arts at Monash University, where he held a personal chair. He's a biographer, of course, but also many of you might remember his earlier work on Louis and Hilda Essen, which was nominated for numerous awards. He's a novelist, theatre critic and scholar, writer of AFI award-winning film screenplays. In theatre, Peter is the author of the book for Anthony Costanzo's musical Life's a Circus, which was nominated for a Green Room Award for Best New Musical. He devised and wrote Flower Children, the Mamas and Papas story, a multiple award-winning musical that will have its return season at Melbourne's Comedy Theatre next year. He's directed more than 30 plays and musicals at Monash University, and he's directed also at Melbourne's National Theatre. Please make him welcome.
This is fantastic for me. It's a bit like kind of old home thing. There's so many people I haven't seen for far too long. But thank you so much for coming and for braving the horrific weather forecasts, at least. Even if the actuality hasn't been quite so bad. I'm going to keep going on the thank yous for just a bit. Most authors at their launches, in my experience, start with declaring how enticing and important their project was and how diabolically hard it was to pursue. Then they move to thanks, and then they usually run out of time. So I decided to go the other way around. I thought I'd do the simple, the sincere and inadequate stuff first, the thank yous, and then talk about the enticements as I found them and the drama of the chase. I'll keep the thanks very brief. I've got a very salutary memory, which I'll share with John Preston, who's put in somewhere, of Kevin Bulldog Murray, a famous Fitzroy footballer, receiving his Brownlow Medal in 1969. Kevin was legendary for his tats and his toughness and his toothlessness, and also for the fact that he spoke for something like 27 minutes. The story changes by the years, thanking everybody in his life. Up to, but not quite including, the midwife who assisted in his delivery. So I'm not going to have a crack at his record. I'm hoping to do this in about 3.5, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book. As a shortcut, I can refer you to the acknowledgements page, which Graeme's already quoted from. A number of the people who are on that acknowledgements page are here: Frank Van Straten and John Preston, whom I've mentioned, and others probably who I'm probably too nervous to remember now. I will mention the big three who appear on that in that set of acknowledgements, though, and all of them are here tonight, which is very lovely. Chris Long, who's standing over there. Chris was nominally a research assistant, but really he's an expert consultant. Chris is the most erudite man about Australian film that I could imagine, let alone have met. And his assistance in this project was absolutely fundamental, particularly in relation to the old Frank, who's a hard chap too. You know, the resources there are not so fantastic. Betty Hanna, who by an extraordinary coincidence happens to be standing at Chris's right, was also a research assistant on this project, and a very passionate and professional help through those early years, and I deeply appreciate the contribution of both of them. And Gay, who's already been mentioned, Gay, who's my most incisive critic, and who has read this book 4 times. Now, I'm the only other one who's read this very slim volume, as you see, 4 times. And all I can say is, great love hath no woman that should plough through a massive thing like this that many times. You never have to read it again, though, it's okay. But I owe a lot to some other very important persons who came on board after this thing was written. The Thring thing, actually often people publish comments about it without the art. To John Timlin, who became my literary agent and my great salvation over there. John's confidence in this book was an unfailing resource to me, and he found me a publisher. And for that I will always be immensely grateful, John. To Nathan, who took, I'll say it, a gamble on this thing, and I really hope you don't lose for all sorts of good reasons. And when I warned him that it contained these strange fictional monologues that pop up between the chapters, he said he really liked them. So that was good. And to Sarah, who's been organising tonight's proceedings and has been a fantastic promoter of this book. To Kate, with whom I had many clandestine email communications while I was doing the proofs of Frank Thring. Well, we should. He's a cultural hero of our country. And Frank, the son, while he was a huge presence in the Australia I grew up in, he was also always a counter presence, a kind of scapegrace alternative, a strange exotic bloom, a one-off. I feel as though I know them both quite well by now, but I'm probably completely deluded in that because that's the biographer's problem. I hope that those of you who did know them find in my book something of a person that you remember and something about him that you didn't know before. A lot of you will vividly remember Frank the son, and any of you who remember old Frank, who died 76 years ago, please, before you go, could you tell me any stories that you have in your secrets of longevity inscribed to us, because it's admirable. They were both great liars. The name Frank for both of them was a misnomer on its way to an oxymoron. Old Frank protected himself by continually reinventing himself and by hiding any evidence of Frank the man. He took me into some amazing worlds. To the fairgrounds, where as the great Dexter, he performed conjuring tricks with a wicked pack of cards. To Bunyip, where he hung out his shingle as a shoemaker without ever having trained for the job at all. To the wild west of Tasmania, where he showed movies in church halls and tin sheds. To the waxworks in Burke Street, thank you, Meeby Colligan, for your wonderful work on that area of our history. And into the bizarrely internecine world of the Australian cinema industry in the 1920s. He took me into an almost front row seat in his adventures in making sound movies, first of all in the bird out shell of His Majesty's, now Her Madge, and then in Australia's first sound film studio on the Esplanade of Kilda, where the Novotel looms so large today. He took me into his magnificent but doomed attempt to create a genuinely Australian musical theatre, and to the opening night of Coliseum at the Princess, when most of Melbourne closed down on a summer evening in 1933 for the grand event. He took me, imaginatively, anyway, to Hollywood, where he brokered the deals that, if he'd lived, would have transformed the history of Australian film. As you can see, he's a bit of a hero of mine. But he was also a brilliant liar. He willfully distorted the facts on every public document he ever had anything to do with. Birth certificates, wedding certificates, death notices, stuff that the rest of us find relatively unproblematic. Frank changed names, dates, other supposed facts at will, whether it mattered or not. He did tell the truth very occasionally. In 1927, before a film Royal Commission conducted into collusive practice in the film industry, Frank, who was involved with both Hoyt's Theatres and J.C. Williamson's films at the time, was called to answer a charge that he had a commercial interest in his major competitor, Greater Union Films. He was able to say resoundingly that he had no such interest. He'd sold them at 11 o'clock and he bought them back at 3. Old Frank was a rogue, but in a wonderful cause. You might call him a colourful theatrical identity, with the dodgy implications that colourful racing identities always have. His son was a colourful theatrical identity in the literal sense, spectacularly so, where Frank Sr. tried to make himself a kind of chameleon, a still point among all the amazing moments of history around him. Frank Jr. was all over all of his stories. Everywhere I tried to track him, there he was, striking flamboyant poses all over the foreground. Frank Jr. was a fantasist and tale-teller who mythologised his life partly to entertain anybody who chanced to look at it, but mostly to distract them from looking too closely. And he was a brilliant liar, just like his dad. I won't go on because there are lots of stories in the book that you'll read, but I'll tell you one, which was Fred Parslo's favourite story about Frank. Frank told him how when he and Bobby Helpman were little boys, they would often play together at Rylands, the Tarak mansion where Frank grew up. And Mrs. Helpman and Bobby's mother and Mrs. Thring, Olive, would be downstairs taking tea, and the boys played so quietly. They were so happy to know that the boys were getting on so nicely and playing whatever games little boys did. Well, the games that they were playing were going through Olive's enormous wardrobe of enormous dresses and trying on all of her outfits and using all of her makeup. And Freddie Parslow said he loved to think of these two decorous Tarak matrons sitting with their teacups while this was going on. Well, it was total nonsense. It was a great story that Frank made up, but the facts were that Helpman was born in 1909, 17 years before Frank was born. He went to England in 1932 when Frank was 6. He didn't come back to Australia until 1955 when Frank was on a liner going the other way. This was such a preposterous untruth that anybody who cared to follow it up would surely discover. But all we can say is that this was a man who loved spinning those lies for the simple pleasure of doing so. It's a sense of mischief.
And here's the book I'd like you to get if you can, The Two Frank Thrings. I'm very proud of the result, even though I only had a research input to it. Quite a few photographs in here from my own collection, including some of the early photos of Frank Thring and his production company at work. And in the back, a complete list of the films made by Frank Thring Snr, which I wrote as an appendix. Runs to about 20 pages, so I'm absolutely delighted with the result. And Peter Fitzpatrick, if you see this, Peter, thank you very much for bringing me in on the project. The Two Frank Thrings, please get it. Excellent biography.